So next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Melissa K. Griffith. She is a national security expert whose work explores how states can mitigate the risks and seize the benefits of critical technologies, including AI, semiconductors, 5G, and cybersecurity. As a lecturer at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and senior advisor to the Emerging Technologies Initiative, she examines how technology, infrastructure, and data flows shape state power, national security, societal resilience, and economic statecraft in the digital era. Let's welcome Dr. Melissa.
I'm gonna have to lower this. I'm hobbit-sized, so apologies in advance. All right, thank you to all of the organizers today, to my prior panelists, both Paul and Chris, who did a fantastic job laying out some very important topics. I have both the exciting job and the unenviable task to follow them now, so a tough act to follow. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and chips. I could have just as easily, excellent, off to a fantastic start. I'm going to use the clicker. All right, so I could have easily titled this talk, National Security and AI, What's Compute Got to Do with It? A lot of my background in this space is on the intersection between national security, technology, economic statecraft. So how do these technologies that come about, artificial intelligence being a suite of those technologies, semiconductors being a foundational technology that underpins those advancements, what are the ramifications for national security? How do states intervene? Why should they intervene? A little bit of my background, I'm a lecturer, technology, national security at Johns Hopkins. These are my coordinates if you need to reach me. For the first time in my life, I'm Griffith at jhu.edu, last name only. All right, so here's the primary question I want to explore with you guys today before we sort of move to a more structured discussion. Why have semiconductors found themselves at the heart of American AI national security efforts? And if you have been following the semiconductor industry for the last 70 to 80 years, this is actually a pretty surprising development. So they are born from national security interests. This is the Minuteman II Air Force project, that's missile defense initially, as well as the Apollo space program. So there's an initial defense demand, national security demand, that starts up this industry, but it's very quickly overtaken by commercial interests. It becomes incredibly specialized, diversified, and globalized in terms of where that industry sits and what it produces, only to, in about the last 7 to 8 years, find itself right back in the heart of the national security conversation at the highest levels of government. And now the conversation isn't about national security driving demand, it's about national security interest reshaping that industry, who can play in that industry, where they can play, what capabilities will be allowed to proliferate, and what are the rules of the road, the rules of the terrain in that space. So it's a surprising circumstance for this industry to find itself in. Not only is it sort of surprising and a big pivot for US policy, it is bipartisan, and it has now been sustained across 3 different administrations. So this starts under the prior Trump administration in 2018 with a push against ACML, looking to have them not sell the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, with a focus on many of these advanced capabilities that the semiconductors can now enable. So let's not allow that equipment to traverse, let's not allow it to traverse into the Chinese market. They can't develop their own manufacturing. It's doubled down upon under the prior Trump administration with the export controls against Huawei, which some of us may remember when Huawei was all the rage back in 2018, 2019, as well as there for telco. It's then picked up by the Biden administration and expanded not only to include a broader list of sort of equipment and that kind of most advanced nodes, now having to pull in not just the US, the Dutch, but also the Japanese as main players in that space. But you also see the emergence of, let's talk about AI chips in particular, these leading edge nodes. Let's talk about any US persons that touch within that stack and try to prevent proliferation much more broadly. And those kind of policy innovations expand from 2022, 2023, 2024 into early January 2025 and have been picked up and continued by the current Trump administration, including now some additional export controls on things like inference chips. So we've talked a little bit about training and how you build up those models, inference being the kind of where the rubber meets the road when they're carrying out tasks and being applied. So how do they find themselves here? Because I'm a good social scientist, I'm going to do 3 things. I will do them in order, and I will give you a roadmap with a picture of a road. So I'm going to talk about the national security risks associated with AI. I'm going to stay brief here. We've actually seen a couple of them. Thank you, Paul, for lining a couple of those out for us. Then I'll talk about which of those risks has placed the semiconductor industry front and center in US as well as global politics and what that looks like. I'm going to unpack what we mean by compute there. Hint, it's more than just chips. And then I'm going to end by kind of highlighting a couple key pressing policy challenges where a lot of our objectives are actually in tension with each other. Many of the things we'll talk about today will be in tension with each other, and the question is, how do we navigate those tensions? So what are the national security risks associated with AI? These are 4 broad buckets of risk. There's also a lot of benefits, but I'm focusing solely on the risks and solely on the national security side of that question. The first is the existential or systemic risk. This has gotten, I think, a lot of attention in a lot of public media. The communities that are interested in this sort of see us on a glide path, potentially. The timeline for that is either short-term or medium-term, depending on who you talk to and when you talk to them about it. And they're concerned about that glide path with current innovation hitting a tipping point and pushing over into something that's existential. Some buzzwords there are things like AGI, artificial general intelligence, or ASI, artificial superintelligence. And you can find a diversity of communities that are very interested in this. Notably, though, there's a wide, vibrant debate about how big of a risk this actually is, and it ranges from skeptics to full-on sort of proponents. People that want full pauses, you probably remember the open letter, full pauses on that innovation, to others that want to see more governance efforts to try to shape that, and others still that see this as largely a distraction from other portions of the debate. But there is this national security existential conversation. There's the application-specific concerns. A really good case here would be like nuclear command and control, which is where should I or should I not deploy artificial intelligence applications, and how do I do that in a way that takes into account the fundamentals of national security concerns. So nuclear command and control, pretty darn important for national security, that it function in the way that it should. When I start to integrate that with any kind of new forms of technology, it raises some national security considerations that might be different than how I'm writing my emails. Not that my emails aren't critically important, but they're not nuclear C2 or C3. Then we have geostrategic and geoeconomic risks. This is the China buzzword of the moment. And here the argument is that artificial intelligence are changing how states project power militarily and economically. We have this kind of ship rising across all of our industries. This is going to change warfare, society's economic power. We probably want to either be on a better footing or maintain equal footing with peer adversaries, frenemies, rivals, however you want to sort of frame that conversation. And the last one, which Paul fantastically covered, is the security or insecurity of AI systems. And that can range from the cybersecurity sets of considerations, data poisoning, alignment, guardrails on up, where you're focused on the security considerations of those systems, security and safety. Of these 4, which of those has put the security or the semiconductor industry front and center in US and sort of global politics from 2018 onward? Chips kind of have a role to play in all of these, and I mean chips as in semiconductors, not our favorite snack with guacamole. But if you look across these 4, there's really 2 that have animated US policy as it relates to AI that have pulled semiconductors in. The first is this sort of concern around existential sets of considerations, which has sort of loomed under particularly the Biden era of export controls and industrial policy in that space. And the second is China and geostrategic risk. A lot of the existential stuff folds under the third because a lot of the concern there was, hey, if I think we're on that glide path, I want the US to get there first. I want our governance structures to dominate that moment. We want that competitive advantage. So I'm going to do what every good social scientist does, and I'm going to fold the first under the third, and we're just going to talk about the third. All right. We've already covered a lot of this. I think Chris talked through a lot of these things. But just to make sure we're on the same kind of page, why are we talking about compute at all in this space? When we think about artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning as a subset of that kind of research field, there's a couple things that matter to that. Talent isn't on this page, and it should be. It's sort of the floor upon which this stool sets. But we have algorithms, we have data, and we have compute. And compute sits at a couple different key places, right? So compute is necessary to process, analyze, and store data. We don't always talk about this portion of compute enough, but that's critical to the artificial intelligence enterprise. It's also essential for us training models to make predictions or inferences. That last portion is growing significantly when we think about the types of compute architecture we have to build. If we were talking 3 years ago, we were mostly talking about the training and data components of this. And now, as all of us are using these applications and we're deploying more and more at scale, now we're talking about inference and the sort of ability to use them. Very different compute load. I think it's also really important because as DeepSeek makes waves, and people are looking at sort of covering that, there is a compute component to model distillation as well, which is an important feature of the DeepSeek compute stack, what they used in that space, and that happened to be cloud-based and very likely on US cloud. All right. So let's break down compute. If that's the sort of national security rationale, and we're looking at compute as a core portion of artificial intelligence and machine learning, what do we mean by compute? Let's break down my own buzzword, so I'm not guilty of just playing buzzword bingo for you. So computing power, when we think about that term, it really is three things that are operating together for you there. It's the process and analyzing and storage of data. We've talked about these four. But below that, it's the chips underpinning AI, the data centers and devices housing them, and the energy grids powering them. If you need access to compute, you're talking about all three of these things. In that first category, there's one chip that gets all the attention. It tends to be things like GPUs and TPUs, parallel processing units and capabilities. But when you think about how these chips get used, when they're integrated into things like data centers or end user devices, everybody's phone, for example, in this space, you're also talking about things like memory chips, CPUs, networking chips. So there's actually a real diversity of chips that sit around that GPU that are equally as fundamental to that process. Those sit in things like data centers, or they will sit on your device. And increasingly, we're seeing them on the device as the space where inference will have to happen. And then you need the energy grids powering them. And I've flagged that here for a second. That is no easy policy problem. It's actually one of the thorniest, stickiest problems facing the United States today. All right. So if we're thinking about compute, that includes data centers. Those can be privately owned and operated on premises. They can also be cloud-based. And this also includes the on-device edge compute, which is taking on a larger and larger role. And there's some interesting question on when we might see that take over a much larger role of the inference landscape, innovation-wise, in that space. This ecosystem is highly centralized, particularly in the data center community. So 60 to 70% of supercomputers are in the United States, globally. Of that, we have primarily them residing in industry. If I was giving this talk 50 years ago, that would not be true, or even 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. This is a shift from kind of these primary compute ecosystems residing in industry and government, academia and government, now residing primarily and heavily within industry, so privately owned spaces. And they're dominated by a kind of small group of hyperscalers, and those that aren't the hyperscalers tend to be collaborating with the hyperscalers. So this is centralization down the line. We're nestling Russian dolls here. All right. So two other facts to sort of keep in mind about compute before we talk about the policy intervention space. So not only is it highly centralized, heavily residing in the US, heavily residing with industry, and heavily talking about hyperscalers, not to mention the energy grids, we also have two features that make the compute AI intersection really interesting. We're talking about a fairly recent phenomenon in this space on two levels. One of which being the idea that we would now design compute architecture specifically for AI workloads. So historically, all of those sort of boom-bust winters that we saw described by Chris and also by Paul were using available compute infrastructure that was designed for something else entirely, including originally the GPU, the graphics processing unit, which was for, hint, it's in the name, graphics processing, and not for artificial intelligence LLM use cases. So it's only until very recently that the economic value here is high enough that we get a whole industry solely committed to designing this and specializing in this and deploying this, where we can now say AI compute, sometimes called AI chips in that space. That has also been a fairly recent phenomenon around the same period that we're talking about Transformers 2017, where we have enough compute that is sufficiently efficient, where we have enough time and enough data sets with a reasonable amount of energy to have the sort of ChatGPT moments that we're talking about today. So compute also sort of underpins that inflection point. The second thing I want to flag is just the scale we're talking about here. So in 2012, AlexNet was trained on 2 GPUs. If we look at ChatGPT, we're talking about tens of thousands. If we're looking at systems today, we're talking about hundreds of thousands, and they're moving up and talking about millions. So we just have a scale inflection point here that's incredibly significant to the infrastructure build out. All right, so why might a state intervene? You now know far too much about AI and chips than any of you really wanted to. You're like, why are we here? I don't care about hardware. Let's talk a little bit about why state governments, the United States, but not the US alone, are choosing to intervene on chips themselves. So they're really worried about artificial intelligence, and they have a series of policy sets of consideration. They want to slow proliferation. They want to deny capabilities to adversaries or near-peer competitors or frenemies, choose whatever language you want to use there, whether that's Russia after the invasion of Ukraine or it's China in that space. They're also trying to solidify leads, so you'll hear a lot of language about we have 6 months or 2 years, innovation leads that give us competitive advantages. So this is about maintaining status quo as a leadership across. That's complicated because we don't have a good way of measuring that, but there's a lot of lead language in this space. There's also about maintaining and building competitive advantage. No one says this, but it's 100% true. Every national country that's looking at this has an interest in their own domestic industry. But you want to kind of house it a little bit more in national security language, but has an interest in having domestic industry that's very competitive in this space. It's also about reducing points of dependency. This is that resiliency or choke point sets of concerns, manufacturing being one of those segments that is most narrow, where we are not a primary player, but there are others as well. And then finally, it's also about reducing access and enabling governance. So you'll see a lot of conversation about we want artificial intelligence to look a certain way, to be governed by certain principles, to avoid certain types of human rights abuses, for example. How do we do that meaningfully? And if you're looking at this triangle, I haven't had it up here this long for no reason, you're sort of starting to say, I have a couple places I could intervene if those are my goals for artificial intelligence. If I, as a state or national security set of concerns, feel I need to, where could I intervene for those sets of considerations? And you have three big contenders right here in this space. You could also include the trained models, which are sort of a byproduct of a lot of these things here. And there's a reason they reach for compute so heavily. And I'm kind of giving you a couple examples here. Compute is really advantageous if your goal is to have really solid leverage. So here we're talking about concentrated supply chains with relatively a few number of players in each of those segments, some slightly more diverse than others, but a few number of players in each of those segments. And they're concentrated heavily and specialized heavily amongst US and partner countries. That's shifting a little bit, but there's still pretty strong centers of power in that space. This point of leverage is why you can see the US start to do equipment bans around semiconductor manufacturing, because they're looking at three countries they need to go with them. Themselves, ideally, the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands. Three countries whose companies sit at that one segment. Highly specialized, good point of leverage. It also happens to be that it's infrastructure. And I don't need to tell anyone here that infrastructure is sticky. It takes a long time to build. It's a massive capital investment. It includes things like cement and cooling and like rebar. It's a very significant investment. And we talk a lot about chips, but it's much broader than that. And it has long-term consequences. Often when we say, why did Supercomputer be built this way? It's like, well, because it was funded 10 years ago, and we finally got it out now, and we made that decision 10 years ago, and what it would look like. So it's sticky, which makes it a good thing to reach for intervention. And it also is tangible, it's hardware. So if I'm trying to prevent goods from traveling across borders, it's actually really hard to do that with algorithms. It's really hard to do that with things that are basic math. So for example, we don't have to calculate out all of our decimal points. Really hard to come to that realization. Really easy for fast followers to just go, great, how many decimal points do we need? And then copy that, much, much harder. To prevent things like algorithms or trained models with the open source community as well, proliferating. And we're talking about scale. That shift from 12 to tens of thousands to 100,000s to millions, at this point, not only just for one frontier model, but for an economy to be able to access these kind of resources, massive scale. So we're not sort of camels and ships. There was always this analogy that ended up in the news, are they gonna put chips on camels and take them across the desert? No, right? You're not taking 1 million chips on a camel. That's one impressive camel. So we're talking about a scale here, very costly for countries to stand this up independently. So there's a lot of points of leverage down the line. All reasons I might reach for chips. Is it all good news? Unfortunately, no. Chips are also really problematic as your policy lever for impacting AI outcomes for national security reasons. And here's just a couple of those reasons, and I'll highlight just a few here. It's not a very good, it's an imprecise measure for which things, trained models or otherwise, count as national security threats. Those that use the most compute are not necessarily the most risky in that space. So it's a bit imprecise, but it does do an okay job on the Venn diagram side. It does spur domestic innovation, particularly in the country you're denying that access to. And we have seen this within China and the stand-up of their own ecosystem, whether that's SMIC or Huawei, whether it's telcos or whether it's AI applications and data centers. When you cut a very highly resourced country off with significant domestic demand, enough capital and pretty sophisticated workforce, they will start to out-innovate in their own space. The question is how quickly and at what scale. You also shift business models. It's not surprising to anyone that US industry is deeply concerned about how competitive they can remain globally with these types of interventions, particularly export controls, inbound, outbound investment on those industries, because they're denied a global market that their competitors in other countries are not denied in that space. It's also a very sticky industry in and of itself. Hardware innovation is not fast, so every chip you see hitting the market today, whether that's NVIDIA or AMD, they were not designed with the current export controls in mind. They're attempting to retrofit them to that, but these were 2 to 5 year bets from previous generations. A couple others that I want to flag here. We do risk the design out of US industry, and this is already happening, because US firms face higher scrutiny on export controls, including this US persons clause. Other companies around the world, whether that's Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, or the Asia Pacific, will start to pick other providers when possible for those same products because they're not held to those same restrictions on what markets they can and can't sell into. So you'll start to see a little bit of a design out. We're already seeing that happening in this space. And really importantly, as a social scientist, I want to flag at the bottom, not all choke points can turn into chokeholds without your allies and partners. And if they are not moving uniformly, you're just creating a bit of a diversion effect where US industry can't sell into that market, but that industry's peer competitors in, say, Japan and the Netherlands can. And those are their direct industry competitors in that space. It makes it very difficult to out-innovate. All right, so if those are sort of the national security objectives, the reasons you would reach for compute to sort of solve some of those national security objectives, and maybe some reasons to like take your hands off the compute as the potential lever, what does that mean for some of the pressing policy challenges that we face? And not to sort of bring the room down, but I'm going to give us 5 things to sort of track and be thinking about that are actually very challenging. These are not easy to solve in this space. So one is this dichotomy between throwing sand over your shoulders, so denying your adversary access to compute, pretty far down the supply chain to do that, right? I'm on a thing that goes into artificial intelligence development and deployment, trying to throw that sand over my shoulder, make them run a little slower, but also running faster myself. Those are cutting against each other in the current moment, where I'm sort of sabotaging a little bit over my shoulder, but I'm also making it very difficult for my own industry to innovate and remain globally competitive, which is part of the reason we have so many of these leads and advantages in the current moment as well. So I've got these 2 objectives that are actually in tension, that are deeply challenging. What's the right balance between the 2? The second is this international cooperation and coordination component, which will be central to sort of trying to solve number 1 here. And while we've had some symmetries and some reforms across, this has actually been pretty sporadic and not uniform, which is deeply challenging. It's some of the reasons why we're seeing some of these other costs coming down on US industry. So solving that political problem, anyone who's a sort of policy person in the room is like, yes, simple, we'll just solve number 2. Deeply challenging in its own right. The third is the durability or lack thereof of leads in this space. How much of a lead counts? If China, for example, DeepSeek simply has to use more energy intensive and more chips, but can get to similar outcomes for a distilled model, does it matter if we're using fewer chips and more energy efficient chips if they're willing to bite the cost in that space? And they kind of have to bite the cost because they don't have access elsewhere. So this sort of, do you technically have a lead, but is that lead consequential enough for the kind of intervention and the cost of that intervention? The last 2 are related to each other, and I want to sort of flag these to this room in particular. Everything I just talked about up to this point has been heavily over-indexed on innovation. So very, very focused on controlling the compute infrastructure and who leads on AI innovation, what those frontier models look like, the types of things we're seeing come out, who's on that leading edge. The reality is all of the kind of parts we really care about artificial intelligence in terms of the economic benefits and what you can do with it are on deployment. It's on the inverse side of this, which this was the kind of birth of the AI deployment age. This is what Jeff Ding calls much more the diffusion side of AI, if anyone's read his fantastic book recently, but age of deployment. And that's a completely different policy set of levers. It's a completely different compute architecture. We're focusing a lot more on inference, for example, and building up specialized infrastructure that is housed and understands and is kind of built around the needs of inference, not just training models, and building that access. It also gets to some of the questions of where is that institutional infrastructure built? Which countries, which communities, who has access? At what cost do they have access to those infrastructure? Right now we're running in what can only charitably be described as, please give me more chips, we don't have enough chips. So the scaling law in this space, all of the big kind of foundational players, in about every 6 months are doubling the number of chips they need for their outputs. We talk about Moore's law every 2 years, doubling the number of transistors. The scaling law here for productivity is doubling every 2 years for what they're looking for. And that gets us to this question about how do we prioritize AI infrastructure, not just AI innovation, both in equitable ways, but sustainable ways. We haven't talked enough about that energy question. I'd love to see some of the brains in this room focusing on that, as well as, and I think critically on the national security side, who's building that? A lot of our export controls, a lot of our interventions and our industrial policy are down the supply chain. They're focused on a lack of proliferation, things not moving across borders, which we hope somehow will kind of pull down Chinese giants in that space, so they'll be more reliant on US software companies, right, the models themselves that are coming out of the US, but not be able to build an independent ecosystem. We have a question of who's building the infrastructure within China, hint, it's Chinese companies. It's not just who's building the infrastructure in the US companies, it's who's building the infrastructure around the world. And that right there is not getting enough sort of national security attention, but also the broader political questions as well. So I will end there. Thank you so much.
Questions for Thank you. That was very interesting. Could you help us understand the Netherlands and Japan component, like what's their contribution as distinct from the US?
Yeah, so it's on a couple different fronts, so sort of understanding. So the Netherlands and Japan, forgive us political scientists, we have a variety of trilaterals. This is one of the most critical trilaterals in the chip space, and it's because they sit on the kind of infrastructure question around equipment. So this is photolithography, EUV, DUV, but other types of equipment that you need to manufacture. So if I'm looking at TSMC in Taiwan, these are the 3 countries who hold the companies that supply the equipment to something like TSMC, as well as what's happening in Arizona and around the world across the stack. And it's very narrow, it's 3 countries. The issue there is in 2022, the United States, October 7th, 2022, the first round, we doubled down again on October of 2023. We keep to the October for a couple years running. We aim a lot of our export controls specifically at that equipment section, which is, okay, if I don't want you to be able to manufacture, it's not just can you get chips from TSMC, it's can you get the equipment to set up your own domestic industry to start to manufacture. So we shift our export controls to target that. That requires a radical shift in our own policy apparatus on export controls, and it would require the same from the Netherlands and Japan. We go first on that particular issue. About a month later, you get both the Japanese and the Netherlands saying, we will also review and figure out what we want to do in that space, because we obviously want to stay aligned as allies, and I'm using quotation marks there intentionally. And they do, they review and they do sort of tighten up. The US has an extraterritoriality component of this because of the US person. So if a US person touches any portion of this, it's now subject to our jurisdiction, which kind of pulls even some of those that would prefer not to be involved into that jurisdiction. They do update their export controls, but not enough and not as uniformly with the United States. So there's still a bunch of these gaps. So what you have happen is US industry go first on 1/3 of a chokehold. So it's sort of only like a very light chokehold in that space. And then the 2 other partner countries who have different sets of objectives, whose national industry plays different parts in their ecosystems, who have very different legal and regulatory frameworks on how to do export controls, try to adjust, but not fully, and they're kind of fast following in that space. They come out, I think, 6 to 8 months later in each country. And so you still get quite a bit of kind of chips continuing to move and equipment continuing to move in that space. And that's only a problem that's getting worse on the allied coordination front. These are deeply challenging, and many of these are nationally important industries. Similar problem with the US, South Korea, and Japan as well. Similar problem with the US and the EU. This kind of, can we coordinate effectively on our policies, bites in a variety of ways.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. I have 2 questions. One is related directly to your topic, and that is, how much does the rivalry between China, Russia on the one hand, and the United States on the other, or maybe it's a triangle, affect actual policy? And control of the whole production cycle necessary for this kind of computing. You say it's bipartisan, but I'm not as familiar, of course, as you are with this, but it seems to me that at least the Biden administration was leaning a little bit more towards the private sector than the current administration. So I would like to ask you to clarify that. The second question is whether you are aware, maybe the data is not out yet, but are you aware of any affectation on U.S. capacity based on the DOGE cuts?
Yeah, the last one's a really hard question. So I think taking the bipartisan nature, the kind of importance of semiconductors, the export control conversation, that's been very stable and ramping across the couple administrations. The language around it is different in sort of tone and tenor. The approach to allies and partners is different across Trump's first administration, Biden's administration, now Trump's second administration. So there is variation there. I think it's important to point out that this is bipartisan. It did start under the Trump administration because sometimes we have a little bit of short memory in DC, so there is some agreement on that space. I think the second point, though, that you're correct to sort of address here is there is some kind of shifting in the middle there, right? So the AI diffusion rule that came out of BIS at Commerce, right at sort of, it was January 2025, just as the Biden administration was exiting, has just sort of been paused under the Trump administration, but not revoked in the way we might consider. It's actually just looking at saying, okay, we didn't want to create 3 tiers of countries, which was problematic on a variety of levels, including the fact that in tier 1 we split the European market, which doesn't work. You can't import to Germany and then not go to France, for example. That's a single market, and they're going to do it on a more bilateral basis. We don't know what that looks like, but the spirit of that is the same. The other portion that we haven't talked about that is not bilateral at all is trade, which has an incredibly significant impact on the semiconductor industry, which, unlike some other industries, can get hit 3 times. So it can get hit across the semiconductor ecosystem life cycle, and it can also get hit on the inputs into that, so critical minerals, so things that go into that life cycle, and we don't care about chips unless they're in something, so they can get hit again on the end user of those spaces, which is deeply concerning if we take this premise that this is a geostrategic foundational technology seriously. So bipartisan and across. China, yes, right? Like it is a looming set of concerns across all of these. A kind of first order principle, we would not have seen a lot of these efforts. I'm going to posit this. I can't reverse us and run this national experiment, but we wouldn't have seen a lot of this kind of intensity and complete radical shift of US statecraft and economic statecraft for national security purposes that we've seen in the last 8 years if there wasn't a large concern around a rising China and what that looked like economically and militarily. And you can see that in a lot of the language, that's driving that both on the existential and otherwise space. Russia is there as well, but it's much more in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and denying military technology and military application chips, which are not what's fueling the AI revolution at all. They're completely separate stacks in that space. We are still very early to know what the implications of current cuts will do. There's a couple of places that could bite that we should all be just tracking in general. One is on the raw innovation components of these, and that tends to be like a 10 to 20 to 30 year bet, so we won't necessarily see some of the implications as we pull back on basic science engineering funding that's quite early in the stage. And we don't know on infrastructure what infrastructure build out is going to look like yet. We don't quite know what the current administration feels about the CHIPS Act that had its sort of origins under Trump 1 as well. So there's a lot of moving pieces there. Some other things that could shift the sort of AI future that we're talking about, a recession would be one. We would not need nearly as much compute because we wouldn't see just as much of this sort of rapid build out into the AI space that we're seeing today if we saw a financial recession or if there was significant financial uncertainty and funding uncertainty. Another would be if we just don't build this infrastructure. So China's on a significant glide path up, and we're kind of like here, both on the energy and the data center side. And that's due to a variety of things, labor, permitting, the build process, the energy infrastructure, both generation and transmission. So those would be things to track across those as well.
What about the implications of the Chinese embargo on rare earth metals and things like that are so involved in this process? What do you see the impact of that to be?
Yeah, what I should have drawn was just like the world's worst version of Christmas lights once you like pull them out of a box, or Hanukkah lights, right? Because you get inputs from this all over kind of your ecosystem. And critical minerals is another one. There's some uncertainty, so there has just been a series of kind of talks, conversations between the US, Japan, or US and China, and we'll see sort of where that hits on critical minerals. It is true that every time we place additional restrictions on access to tech for China, they don't sit there and say, oh shucks, I guess we'll do nothing. One of the areas they do reach for is critical minerals, as well as other products that we're highly dependent on. That's concerning on twofold. It's a question of where those minerals are found. So like this is a where can you actually do the mining component to that. That's moved primarily out of the US for a variety of reasons, out of the United States. Some of that is within China. And then the other is where do they have access or sort of preferable agreements for extraction. So that kind of ranges across, for example, the continent of Africa is a prime example there. But there's a lot of question about the United States and sort of gaining access, potentially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, to areas where there's sort of privileged access for Chinese companies. So it cuts in both spaces, and you are seeing stockpiling in the United States, but this would be an area. I think the other thing I could put up here is just like, this is turtles all the way down, complex interdependence across the board, highly integrated and very specialized, long event horizon industries that are highly capital intensive. So pulling these apart and not expecting global ramifications of that, both economically, as well as just in terms of like what these industries can do and the implications of that would be kind of, I think, a little bit over generous. We're gonna see some pretty significant shifts there.